Chats with Professor Fadhel Kaboub. Professor Kaboub is Associate Professor at Denison University. He's also very well known as the President of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And you can follow GISP on Twitter and YouTube and, well, almost anywhere because they have a great digital footprint. Professor Kaboub writes in the Post Keynesian and Institutionalist traditions. He writes in the fields of macroeconomic, monetary theory and policy, and he writes on economic development. I first met Professor Kaboub, although of course I'd heard of him because I had several very close colleagues who had studied with Professor Kaboub. But I first met Professor Kaboub at the MMT conference at Kansas City. And I was blown away because I think this was the first person I met who was talking about MMT from a global South perspective. When I went to UMKC and when I encountered modern money theory, I had already had a history. I was from JNU before that. So, I had already been introduced to heterodox economic thought. So, today, most of our students come to MMT as heterodox economic thought. For me, I had come to it very differently. I came to it from Kaleski and Post Keynesian lenses. So to me, MMT was new, but because I had seen it before, I didn't have the same reaction that many young people today have when they encounter MMT, and they're absolutely thrilled. So I had a lot of questions, and Professor Kaboub really helped answer many of the questions that I had over the years. So I will go back on script. I just went off for a bit. Anyhow, Professor Kaboub argues that nations with sovereign monetary systems can afford to ensure full employment and price stability, which means the Job Guarantee Program, programs like our Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, but universalized, right? And this can be afforded at a fraction of the cost that is borne by economic systems and countries who are under fiscal austerity. Building upon modern money theory, Fadhel argues that many developing countries need to develop policies that help them regain monetary sovereignty in order to achieve full employment and sustainable prosperity. So today we will be talking about neoliberalism, we'll talk about fiscal sovereignty, and we'll talk about the global South and how do we recenter this conversation from a global South perspective. Welcome, Fadhel. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Ruchira. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Since you've digressed a little bit, I'll take the opportunity here and digress a little bit just to contextualize how I came into this space as a grad student. I was introduced to what is now known as MMT, modern monetary theory, and I had a lot of questions. I was one of the critics, many of the grad students at the time from the global South. The interest was so high that we sort of rebelled against the idea because no, this doesn't work in the global South. We have all these constraints, all these different problems. This can only apply for the US or Canada or the UK. And that's how this research agenda really started, with a lot of questioning of the and kind of synthesizing some of the old traditional economic development work from the global South and kind of bringing a synthesis of some of those ideas that have been dismissed in the 70s and 80s with the rise of neoliberal economic thinking. And today we find ourselves, I hope, in a situation of potential paradigm shift in the economics profession that requires a lot of rethinking of fundamental ideas. And I think the global South, young scholars, graduate students in particular, will have a critical role to play here, especially as we enter into a new research agenda for a PhD dissertation or graduate work. You want to ask yourself, do I want to pursue research within the framework of the existing paradigm? When I say existing paradigm in kind of the philosophical sense of the term, we're talking about the paradigm that is colonial fundamentally, a paradigm that is hierarchical, patriarchal, exclusive, those are the foundations, from a philosophical standpoint. And I think we live the consequences of this. Or do we want to contribute to building a new paradigm that learned from the existing problems that we have in the South, challenges that we have globally today in terms of climate change, inequality, and so on, and build a new foundation that can ensure equity, that can ensure sustainable prosperity, that can guarantee a transition to a livable planet and a livable environment in the global South, in the global North. I think these are the big philosophical questions that every young person needs to struggle with, and then dive into the economics of it, and always question, is this economic model that I'm working with coherent, consistent with this paradigm shift that we're undertaking? So that's kind of how I wanted to frame the larger conversation today. So I'm happy to answer any questions. So we decided to do this in a chat format as opposed to a formal presentation.
Right. So, well, since we are doing this as a chat, I'm just going to begin with probably Fadhel's favorite question. Fadhel, what are some of the constraints that, that developing countries encounter when they're building their own sovereign, independent development policies?
Very good question. So I like to start this from a colonial, post-colonial framework. And my starting phrase is usually that the global South was not colonized because it was poor. It was colonized because it was extremely rich, right? So the economic model that was introduced with the colonial system was fundamentally extractive, was fundamentally abusive. And the post-colonial structure that developed afterwards with independent nations, independent states with elected governments and military and borders and flags and all of that, those post-colonial economic systems were not truly decolonized, right? We decolonized the territory, we decolonized the flag, the national anthem, and all of that, but we didn't decolonize the system. And today, unfortunately, in many parts of the world, the struggles with democracy, with justice, have something to do with that fact, the fact that we can't democratize a system that hasn't been truly decolonized. So what is that colonial, post-colonial system that we're dealing with here? And what are the economic consequences? The more visible consequence of this on the economic front, you see it as in the form of external debt crisis, which many parts of the world are experiencing now, especially after the COVID crisis. So external debt, by which I mean debt denominated in foreign currencies, not in the national currency. And that is to say, when you have a massive amount of external debt, you have to figure out a way to generate revenues in dollars, in euros, in British pounds, and Japanese yen in order to service your debt. So where do you get those dollars and euros? You can earn them through exports. You can earn them through foreign direct investment. You can earn them through tourism, capital flows, especially if you set up a mini Wall Street to attract financial investment. You can earn them through remittances from your nationals working abroad, so your brain drain, essentially. So these are more or less the main sources that all mainstream economists tell you. If you want to address the debt and address poverty and address the issue of economic growth and so on, you need to generate export revenues, foreign direct investment, remittances, tourism, all of those things. And I argue that these are fundamentally traps, structural economic traps that actually make the debt problem, the external debt problem, worse over time and fundamentally undermine the economic stability of a country. I'll give you an example. When you look at most developing countries, export-led growth immediately generated a serious constraint on the external balance. Why? Because we specialized in assembly line type of manufacturing, which means you import the high value added content and you export lower value added content, which forces you to abuse your people and your ecosystem, ecologically speaking, to race to the bottom to try to accelerate your exports as much as possible at a lower cost, right? Which is an endless trap. Now, if you manage over time to escape that trap somehow by investing in research and development, technical skills, education, infrastructure, you'll start to specialize in higher value added manufacturing content, and you start to balance a little bit the value added of what you import versus what you export. The extreme case obviously is purely extractive export industries, where you extract raw materials with low cost labor, huge environmental damage, and what you export, you end up re-importing it as consumer products. And this is true even for the biggest energy exporters, oil exporters. They export crude oil, which is a useless material at the end of the day, and then they re-import the refined petrochemicals, the gasoline, the kerosene, the petrochemicals that we use in industrial production. Again, value-added content and the cost to the environment and the labor cost involved. So that's one of the fundamental structural traps. The type of industrialization that we pursued was fundamentally leading to this structural deficiency. And this structural deficiency, you can only escape it by doing the exact opposite of what austerity policies would suggest, which is invest long-term with the big push structural investment in education, health, research and development that will place you at some point to become more selective in the types of industries that you specialize in, more selective also in the types of foreign direct investment that you bring into the country. Because most of the global south now, the FDI that we receive is really built into that trap, which means low value added content. And FDI is even worse than export, because at least when you have your domestic exporters extracting profits from the economy, they may in general reinvest it domestically. But when you have FDI, which is external to your system, the profits from FDI are often repatriated somewhere else, not reinvested in the country. So that's one example. The second structural trap that many developing countries have has to do with second and third, I should say, large amounts of food imports, lack of food sovereignty, not just food security. And a lot of people are beginning to understand the difference between food sovereignty and food security in the last few months in the global south. And number three, the lack of energy sovereignty, especially renewable energy sovereignty today. And you can't run an economy without food, without energy. These are foundational. So what happens here when you have external debt, because of the structural trade deficits that you have in the food sector, structural trade deficit that you have in the energy sector, then that puts downward pressure on your exchange rate, right? Everybody understands this. So a weaker national currency means everything you want to import the next morning, whether it's medicine or food or capital equipment or fuel, is going to be more expensive. So you're importing inflation with everything you do. And that puts the government now face to face with the serious decision. Do we let this happen and face the consequences of bread riots and, instability, social and political instability because of the rising cost of living? People can't afford transportation or food. Or do we intervene to protect the most vulnerable? And that intervention means borrowing dollars and euros and British pounds in order to artificially stabilize the exchange rate. And I emphasize artificially. And that's what builds the external debt. And many countries do that in addition to subsidizing basic foods, right? The food and transportation and health, medicine and so on. And now you're in that structural trap, right? Unless you figure out a way to address the root causes. Now, many heterodox economists, myself included when I started in this space, we looked at this constraint and we said there's really nothing you can do about it other than end capitalism or change the global supremacy of multinational corporations and all of that. And I agree with a lot of these statements, but how do you do it at the national level with your own vision, with your own strategy? Is there a way out, or do we have to wait for capitalism to end somehow? Do we have to wait for the system to implode? I prefer to work on what can we do rather than facing the problem and saying there's nothing we can do. It's too complicated. So what can be done is you start empowering existing movements in many countries in the global south with peasants and farmers around the country who are working on the concept of food sovereignty, because every dollar you invest in building food sovereignty domestically will save you hundreds more in terms of imported foods and debt service for decades to come, and gives you resilience to external shocks when it comes to climate change, when it comes to global trade problems, supply chain problems, and allows you to focus on the next item on your agenda. Same thing on the renewable energy front, especially for many countries in the global south now that have the natural resources that are there, the technical capabilities. I'm talking about large developing countries like India, like China, like Brazil, and many more, and also have access now to cheaper technology, more efficient technology. It's a no-brainer to forge ahead with massive investments to build the level of renewable energy sovereignty that will ultimately translate into higher degrees of monetary sovereignty, higher degrees of economic sovereignty. So these are fundamental: food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and a very specific strategy for climbing up the ladder of the value-added content. Now, large countries like India, like China, Brazil can do it on their own because you have economies of scale, you have large domestic market and so on. But smaller economies in the global south, they absolutely need to be coupled with the network of global south partners in a south-south strategic partnership type of framework, whereby you have access to larger markets and you have strategic collective resilience goals that build on food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and industrial strategy that allows you to capture as much of the value-added content of what the trading bloc produces as possible. And you start with the basics. You don't have to start with a space program. You start with transportation, health, education, research and development to build that collective resilience. So that's kind of the general framework. But what we hear from the mainstream is, well, why don't you bring more tourism? Well, tourism is extractive too, because the millions of tourists you bring in, you have to feed them, you have to heat and cool the hotels, you have to transport them. So it feeds into those structural traps that I described earlier. They say, well, how about the remittances? Well, remittances, I think everybody in the global south understands, especially today, what remittances are. It's the mirror image of that brain drain that we talked about. It's the human capabilities that we spend, blood, tears, and money to create in the global south, and then deliver as ready to work young people in the global north. It's not worth the dollars that they send back in real terms. But this is again, it's a trap. Financial investment, so capital flows from the globe. If you set up a mini Wall Street, if you create an attractive financial system, well, we've seen this in South Africa and Brazil and Mexico. Every country that kind of creates this artificially attractive financial system in the global south immediately attracts speculators because they want to buy low and sell high. So that immediate flow of capital gives you higher, stronger exchange rate, gives you the illusion of a strong stock market, a strong economy. But as soon as they realize that, that you reach the peak, buy low and sell high, you're going to have a stock market crash, and then you're going to have a currency crisis as speculators exit. So focus on the fundamentals. Don't focus on the artificial adjustments, these band-aid solutions that are structurally dangerous in the long term, and we face the consequences of these decisions. Now, here I want to maybe close this this segment with a statement that I think all of us in heterodox economics need to acknowledge, which is the early development theorists. This is not a critique of the early development theorists, but the early kind of post-colonial era development theorists didn't necessarily see this coming or see these fundamental issues that we see today, because the system was different at the time. Because early post-independence days, most countries in the global south did actually have food sovereignty because they were the breadbasket of the colonial powers, right? Most early post-colonial days in the global south countries didn't have a huge need for energy imports because they were not industrialized, right? And many of them were net exporters of energy. and there wasn't a lot of transportation or energy consumption for households and so on. A lot of these structural problems on the energy front and the food front emerged 2 to 3 decades later, and today are obviously at a crisis level. So not to blame the early theorists, because they focused their big push on other things, on health and education and infrastructure, and in some cases on industrialization proper. So not a critique of their era, but this is kind of taking their lens of thinking about the importance of sequenced investments and big push investments that many kind of UN development economists at the time talked about. Let's take that framework and update it to face the challenges that we have today on the food front, on the energy front, on the climate crisis front, on the inequality front. So again, a call to action to revive a lot of the fundamental ideas that were systematically destroyed by the mainstream in the economics profession and mainstream politics and geopolitics.
We have a couple of comments from some very familiar names. Panioti says that can attest that all aspects of what became MMT were severely tested by the grad students in Fadhel's time and found sound. And yeah. Professor Black says private debt as a means to development can also be a trap. Microfinance became microcredit, and your borrower is basically going on taking loans, and a rolling loan gathers no loss. So to roll a loan is to refinance it. So the debt trap goes on. But anyway, we've talked so far about what developing countries can do, what the mainstream says developing countries should do, and why that is why that is not the answer. But what we haven't yet talked about is what is it the developing countries have done so far? What have they done to try to build a sustainable future? And what are the challenges they have faced in doing what they've done?
Very good question. Well, unfortunately, not much. And I think the last 2 years in particular have really kind of set our feet on fire in terms of thinking outside the box. Not only because of the COVID crisis and the disruptions in the global South and the realization that the economic engine that many countries in the global South use not only needs to be restarted, but fundamentally really needs to be replaced, right? Because it's not leading to this resilience. And then the climate crisis is making it almost impossible to ignore these questions. So I want to be optimistic about what we can do, but the reality is not much yet. And I'll tell you why, for a number of reasons. One is most policymakers in the global South are way too busy putting out fires left and right. I mean, literally in some countries, my own country in Tunisia, the focal question every day is, will we be able to pay the salaries at the end of the month? Will we be able to meet to service the debt at the end of the quarter? That's how short-term focused the discussions are. Will we be able to deal with the health crisis? We'll be able to deal with the border crisis, with the neighboring conflict, and so on. So no strategic long-term thinking. It's just cranking up the existing engine, which is this neo-colonial extractive engine that we described. That is a fundamental problem. Now, which countries are actually thinking long-term, strategic long-term? We're talking about the most powerful countries, the US, China, the EU, Japan, the UK. These are countries that have a vision for the next 50 years. Where do we want our economy, our influence, our presence in the world to be? And that creates a fundamental problem. Because when you have a handful of global powers thinking 50 to 100 years ahead, what they do is essentially set up the puzzle that they want to see in the world, and they will nudge every little country into the spot that they want to see them in, with incentives, with pressures, and fundamentally economic pressures. So that can't be the solution for us in the global South, because if you don't have your own vision, you're part of somebody else's vision, and that's a problem, which means you're always going to be trapped in the neo-colonial system. Whether it's American or British or Chinese, it doesn't matter. It's somebody else's vision, right? So we're not saying you're going to challenge the power of China or the US in a fundamental way, but at least have your own vision in terms of where you want to be in 50 years. The level of economic sovereignty, the level of food sovereignty, the level of economic development, the quality of life in terms of goals you want to set for yourself. And then think strategically, how do we do things differently to escape existing traps? And how do we fit into the global geopolitical map and kind of use the balance of power struggles that are happening between the US and China and Australia and the UK and Japan in order to get the most of what we can achieve, right? And if we can do it individually, that's wonderful. But most importantly, if we can gather a large group of developing countries with an alternative vision for their bloc to be able to negotiate better economic terms and geopolitical terms, then that's how we can make progress. And this is not new. I'm not inventing any of this. This happened with the G77 movement in the context of the Cold War. It needs to happen today in terms of global South movement to negotiate something of the equivalent of a nuclear non-proliferation treaty, but a fossil fuels non-proliferation treaty with just transition for countries in the global South, especially a way to truly decolonize the extractive systems in the fossil fuel industry in particular in the global South. There's some hope. There's actually a large network of colleagues around the world lobbying now for a fossil fuels non-proliferation treaty initiative with thousands of leaders around the world at the local level, at the city level. Hundreds of Nobel laureates have signed it, and there's a momentum there, especially in the global South. A recognition that the existing system is just driving us towards the cliff. And this is based on one simple fact, one simple study, and people can look it up. The United Nations Environmental Program a couple of years ago conducted a study. I think it's called the production gap. Production of what? Of fossil fuels. And it's really looking at what the actual projections are for production of fossil fuels for the next, until the end of the century, versus where we actually need to be in order to decarbonize enough to stay below the 2-degree limit or the 1.5 limit. And the gap is massive, right? We're literally driving, high speed towards the cliff, collectively. So that gap needs to be closed. And that can't be done under any of the terms that we're discussing today in terms of climate negotiations. It can only be achieved if we truly have a vision to completely end the use of fossil fuels and develop alternative energy and so on. And that requires lots of adjustments. That requires fundamental changes in the economic engines that we use in the global South and the global North. And for me, that can't happen under the rapid timeframe that we're looking at unless we put on the table the concept of climate debt, and as a result, climate reparations. And unless we put on the table, because we're changing the extractive neocolonial economic engine, we put on the table the concept of colonial and neocolonial reparations. And reparations in the broadest sense of the term, that is not just transfer of financial resources from north to south, but transfer of technology, so in-kind transfers, and reparations literally in the sense of repairing the economic engine, not restarting it, repairing it as in building a resilient economic engine that's not extractive, that's not colonial, that's not neocolonial, an economic engine that produces equity, that produces clean energy, that produces justice, as opposed to the existing system, which today, if you divide global South and global North, we have a system that globally extracts $2 trillion at least from the global South to the global North in terms of net transfers. We're not going anywhere on any of the big questions unless we fundamentally question those things. And to do it on a rapid scale, it requires that form of reparations, repairing broken structures, canceling odious debt, canceling abusive neocolonial debts, climate debts, and so on.
That is fundamental. In fact, in India right now, we are dealing with a major debate on the issue of decarbonization. To what extent can we decarbonize? How fast can we do it? And there have been a lot of heated exchanges within the academic community in India just on the question of decarbonization.
Yeah, on this, if I may add just one part of this this concept, because a lot of people will be familiar with the idea of decarbonization, but when you look at, starting with the Industrial Revolution, who was responsible for most CO2 emissions? It's the global North, right? Even today, when people refer to China and India as the big polluters, well, not really, because the CO2 emissions that are produced in China and India and many other countries in the global South are really for the purpose of creating consumer products for the global North. So fundamentally, we still have that global North, global South divide in terms of responsibility for climate change. So we're not talking about charity. We're not talking about aid. We're not talking about loans. We're talking about reparations of broken systems, of abusive systems. And I think that has to be the terms of the debate.
Thanks for saying that, Fadhel. I mean, I'm sure it makes many of us feel a lot better when, being called big polluters was difficult. But anyhow, I want to take the conversation back to neoliberalism. We've, talked about neoliberal policies or rather we've talked about neoclassical economics and the solutions that it offers for development economics and why they fail. But we also want to talk a little bit about neoliberalism. Why has the neoliberal economic model failed in particular for developing countries?
Well, because it didn't really fail. It succeeded because it was meant to produce these results. So I'll tell you why. I'll give you a specific example here. Post-colonial times, the global North lost its breadbasket, lost its access to the cheaper resources that it enjoyed during colonial times. So now we're moving into the free trade era of the 60s, 70s, and then of course it accelerates in the 80s and 90s. And when you think of the WTO today, its earlier iteration, the GATT agreements, and all the free trade negotiations that happened at the time, what was the main concern for the global South? It was food exports, right? So if you remember those negotiations, everything was about free trade in everything but arms and farms. That was fundamental. That was the position of the EU, the US, and why? Because the issue of food security and food sovereignty for the global North was important, extremely important. So what happens when developing countries can't export their fundamental economic asset at the time during the colonial, early post-colonial time? Well, farmers go out of business. Well, what do? A lot of them move to the cities. Well, how convenient, because this is when the era of export-led growth in the global South was encouraged, right? Economic growth driven by low value-added manufacturing with low-paid workers, quote unquote, unskilled workers, people who moved from the farms who were skilled farmers, but now they're unskilled, low-cost labor in manufacturing. Manufacturing what? Manufacturing all the stuff that's been deindustrialized, obsolete technologies from the global North, assembly line type of technologies. So that became the economic model. That was not a failure from a neoliberal, it was by design, right? When you listen to European officials, American senators, congressmen at the time, every time the issue of international trade comes up, you hear it, and I'm paraphrasing here, and we can find quotes everywhere. We can't let those developing countries export food to us. We need to export food to them, right? And let them do these industries, not the industries that we want to grow, the industries that. So to me, it's not a failure. When it comes to heavy reliance on external debt, especially in the 1970s, leading up to the 1980s debt crisis. That didn't happen by accident, right? That's why a lot of us talk about the concept of odious debt, where the concept, it's a legal concept, it's an international law concept that's been used actually by the US and the UK in the past to cancel debt legally under international law. And the concept requires three fundamental principles to apply. Number one, the lender, the borrower borrowed the money without the consent of the people in a non-democratic, corrupt way. That applies in a lot of cases. Number two, the money that was borrowed didn't benefit the people, which you can demonstrate in many cases. And most importantly, number three, the lenders knew about it. They knew that the money didn't benefit the people. They knew that the money wasn't borrowed in a democratic, transparent way with the consent of the people. And that's how the Iraqi debt was canceled after the American invasion. That's how the Costa Rican debt almost 100 years ago was canceled. So it's a legal concept, but it's only used and enforced and validated when the US or the UK is involved in saying this debt should be canceled. So it's important for us to use some of the legal mechanisms and call their bluff when you say, oh, you have to pay the debt, right? And sometimes the structural traps that I described earlier make it very difficult even for countries who want to go that far to actually use that concept. I'll give you an example in Tunisia. After the revolution, which happened almost exactly 10 years ago now, the new democratically elected parliament is facing an economic crisis, facing a huge debt that was incurred by the dictatorship. And the debate internally was, do we continue paying this debt that was taken by the dictators, or do we call for a debt audit and cancel the debt and move on with the clean slate? And eventually, the MPs who essentially said, well, if we do that, we're going to embarrass our European friends because they're the ones who are supporting the dictatorship, right? And we really need our European friends for the next, era of our economic development with FDI, with access to markets, with all the traps, with tourism and all of that. So let's just keep paying the debt, right? So that we can keep our friends, not embarrassed. That has to change. That's fundamentally part of the structural traps that we're talking about. I'm talking about this was, a serious national debate, right? That was the consensus. We pay for the debt of the dictatorship that abused the system, that enforced the neocolonial system in order not to embarrass our European friends and our international partners.
There are a couple of messages from Bill Black and another from Drew Westberg, who is typing in from Iowa on Twitter, but I'll pitch Drew's question a little bit later.
Okay. Sure.
Professor Black says that Ecuador used the same concept to cancel its debt, and he says that you have to take on conventional economics. We have to take on conventional economics. He says it has nearly eliminated the study of economic history, and it has turned the Industrial Revolution into a story of innovation.
And that's why I wanted to start by framing this conversation in the context of paradigm shift. Paradigm shift is not tweaking around the edges. It's shifting the entire system and addressing it in a multi-pronged, multifaceted way. And it's like moving mountains, right? Literally. But we're not going to move mountains if we're all working in different directions, trying to tweak the system and on a different scale. We have to have a coherent, comprehensive strategy to do this collectively in a multi-pronged way. And I'm trying to hit on little pieces of this, the components of this paradigm.
So Fadhel, I have been hiding the main meat of this discussion to the end, mostly because I wanted to give you a chance to talk about decolonialism and paradigm shifts and critique neoliberalism. But here comes the big one. What is modern money theory? And what does modern money theory mean for fiscal deficits and current account deficits?
Very good question. So this is the subtext of a lot of what I do, obviously. So MMT, or modern monetary theory, essentially says the focuses on the concept of monetary sovereignty, which is different than political sovereignty, food sovereignty, energy sovereignty. These are subcomponents of what we call monetary sovereignty. So think of monetary sovereignty as a spectrum, whereby you have countries with high degrees of monetary sovereignty on one end of the spectrum, and countries with low degrees, in some cases, absolutely no monetary sovereignty whatsoever. And that is to say, countries like Ecuador, for example, that have dollarized their economy, that they can't issue even a national currency, right? Those are countries that operate under the basic principles of fiscal austerity. You have to earn the revenue in order to spend, or you have to borrow it in order to spend as a nation, as a government. And once you borrow, you're a user of a foreign currency, right? So you have to live within your means. You have to generate more revenues to pay the debt, to service the debt, and so on. That's absolutely constraining, unless you happen to be a massively wealthy nation in terms of natural resources to operate like a hedge fund, right? To build a trust fund that allows you to do that. And even countries of that level of wealth and natural resources struggle, in times of crisis, obviously. Now, the end of the spectrum where you have countries with the highest degrees of monetary sovereignty, you have countries like the US, like Japan, like the UK. These are countries that issue a national currency, check, that's number one. Tax their population in the national currency, check, most countries can do that. But fundamentally, the most important part, these are countries that almost never issue debt denominated in a foreign currency, right? So the entire US debt stock, the national debt, is denominated in US dollars. Japan has the highest degree of debt to GDP ratio, but it's 100% denominated in Japanese yen, right? Whereas most of the countries we've been talking about in the global south have an external debt problem, whereby debt is denominated in foreign currencies. So now you're a user of a foreign currency, so you have to follow the sound finance principles to pay your bills, right? So don't issue debt denominated in foreign currencies. And we talked about why countries are forced to borrow in foreign currencies because of those structural problems, the external balance constraint. So most of my research and the work that I'm inviting people to collaborate on and to work on is how do we get a developing country with a weaker degree of monetary sovereignty that's now trapped into a system whereby it has to borrow foreign currencies to, over time, move to a higher degree of monetary sovereignty and avoid a situation where you have to borrow dollars and euros in foreign currencies. And then the fourth element of this concept of monetary sovereignty, which has to do with the external debt constraint, with the external balance, is the type of exchange rate regime you pursue. So countries with the highest degree of monetary sovereignty don't really have to have a strategy to fix their exchange rate or to manage their exchange rate in the same way that a developing country does. Because the more external debt, the stronger the external balance, the more dangerous exchange rate instability becomes, because it literally translates into food riot the next morning. If your currency is devalued significantly and you're not able to stabilize the exchange rate, all your food imports, all your energy import, or your medicine that you're importing, basic necessities, will hit your consumers the next morning, and you're going to have riots, political instability. So to avoid those riots, you borrow dollars, you borrow euros as a band-aid solution, and you stay trapped in that end of the spectrum with a weaker degree of sovereignty. So if we use this analytical framework, we know where we stand and we know what the constraints. Then we focus our attention on how do we gradually migrate on that spectrum. And it's not going to be migrating from one end of the spectrum to the other by decree, whereby you say, we're sovereign, we're going to declare monetary sovereignty and float the exchange rate and only borrow in the national currency. That's just the result of having a higher degree of economic and monetary sovereignty. The hard work that needs to be done is untangling those traps that we described and having strategic economic development vision to move you over time to that end of the spectrum. And I go back to where we started in the beginning. I argue that fundamentally that can't be done unless you truly have a food sovereignty strategy, renewable energy strategy, long-term. It doesn't have to happen overnight. And a global South-South strategic partnership strategies to avoid the trap of industrialization, where you're dedicating all of your productive capacity essentially to serve the global supply chain as opposed to build resilience for your own economy. And these are the types of conversations that we need to have. And in order to do that, you have to do it in a transdisciplinary way. And if we want to think in academic terms, you have to recognize the global power structures, the geopolitics. You have to have an economic diplomacy strategy that's coherent with this economic vision. And going back to what I described earlier as the geopolitical puzzle that the powerful countries set for the rest of the world, for the rest of us in the global South, you need to acknowledge that and know how to navigate the geopolitical struggles, and increase the amount of options that you have available to you, as opposed to accept what's been given to you as given. And here I want to close by saying that what gives me hope today in terms of these visions starting to emerge, if you listen carefully to what the Barbadian Prime Minister Mia Mottley has been saying over the last couple of years, it gives you hope that some of the fundamental early Independence Day ideas from the 60s and 70s are giving a new life, given the new challenges that we have. And she actually quotes the first Barbadian Prime Minister from the 1970s frequently, where he said, essentially, for us in the global South to thrive and prosper and develop, we have to think not as a colony, not as an early post-colony that's dependent on the global North, but essentially he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm not sure if this is the exact quote, something like, we're going to be friends of all, satellites of none, right? So friends of all, meaning if our strategic vision for food sovereignty, for renewable energy sovereignty, means we partner with China as opposed to Germany or the US, so be it. We're friends with China, we're friends with Germany. It's not like we're enemies of Germany because we're doing a renewable energy partnership with China, and enemies of none, right? And that was the fundamental kind of framework for the G77 movement in the context of the Cold War, and it has to be the vision for the global South in terms of geopolitics, right? We're not going to start a conflict with the global North country because of colonial or neo-colonial legacies, but find solutions somewhere else. If Germany or the EU is not offering solutions that are actually practical from a development perspective, from a resilience perspective, and that partnership can be found with another country in the global South or in the global North, so be it. And the advantage that we have today in the global South, and I'm saying this specifically because we were doing this in an Indian context, is the level of economic development that India has achieved, the technical capabilities, even the geopolitical weight that it carries is absolutely fundamental in taking a leadership position in the global South to change the economic engine of the global South with these strategic partnerships, as opposed to using kind of a neo-colonial, neoliberal existing economic model and fueling a system of trade that we've seen in the past. And the same applies to China, the same applies to Brazil, the same applies to South Africa. But do we really have the coherent global South vision with that 50-year strategy to undo and truly decolonize the global South? I'm not sure we're there yet, but I have some hope.
That was very inspiring, and leaves many of us with a lot to think about. But we've talked about monetary sovereignty, and actually all these years of following MMT, this is actually a really nice formulation, the idea of monetary sovereignty as a spectrum.
May I add one thing to that spectrum? And maybe you were going to ask this question, but a lot of people will say, okay, fine, there's a spectrum, but what does it mean at the end? Well, here's what it means. If you're on the higher degree of monetary sovereignty end of the spectrum, the fiscal spending that your national government has is not constrained in the same way the mainstream economics profession tells us it's constrained. Because we're told governments are constrained by the amount of tax revenues that they generate or the amount of borrowing that the private sector, right, the market has allowed them to borrow. Beyond that, any additional government spending and borrowing will lead to a high national debt, will lead to inflation, potentially hyperinflation, a currency devaluation, and all the economic problems that we're told. And what MMT is saying, the actual constraint is not the amount of revenues the government can generate. The government is a sovereign issuer of its own currency, so it doesn't have an actual constraint of finding the money per se. But that is to say, from an MMT perspective, the real limit to how much governments can spend has to do with the risk of inflation. I mean, we're often accused in the MMT community of not caring about inflation. I beg to differ. MMT economists are obsessed with the risk of inflation. But now this begs the question, what determines the risk of inflation? And the economics profession today is really facing a mini paradigm shift in thinking about the theory of inflation, because mainstream economists are essentially admitting they don't know actually what determines the risk of inflation from a theoretical standpoint and a policy standpoint. It's not my words, it's the Fed, it's the ECB, it's the Bank of Japan that have been saying this. So here's what MMT says about the actual risk of inflation. The risk of inflation is determined fundamentally by two components. One is the availability of productive capacity. That is to say, if you have the physical productive capacity, the labor capacity, the technological capacity, the material resources to produce more, and the government spends more and generates more demand, then that demand will be serviced by your productive capacity, and you will not hit bottlenecks and supply chain constraints and things like that. So once you hit your limits, you will have inflation. So that's the actual limit. Number two, in terms of risk of inflation, has to do with what I would call abusive market power, right? When you have key players in the economy who can raise prices because they can, well, that kind of inflation risk, you can't eliminate it by spending less, by being fiscally conservative. You only eliminate the risk of inflation by taxing and regulating that abusive power out of existence, by democratizing the market, making it more competitive. And when you think globally today, when we have literally the global food system is controlled by more or less 5 giant companies globally, well, we have a problem, right? And when you have supply chain disruptions, like the kind of disruptions that we have now with COVID, fueling that market power, then we have a problem of inflation, but it's fundamentally a problem of democracy. And I say this in the context of the US, India, and other countries around the world, by which I mean, who has the responsibility to tame that abusive market power, to regulate it out of existence? It's the elected officials, the MPs, the senators, the congressmen that we elect, right? It's the fiscal authorities. But what does mainstream economics tell us about inflation? Who's in charge of dealing with inflation? The central bank. The central bank has no influence on abusive market power. They have no policy tool for it, unless you think of the financial system to some extent. But energy prices, pharmaceutical prices, food prices, way outside the jurisdiction of the central bank. And that's where inflation is, right? So it's the fiscal authorities abdicating their responsibility to the central bank. That's a fundamental problem. So what does the central bank do? They raise interest rate. They throw people under the bus. They slow down the economy for the sake of taming inflation pressure points, when the actual source of inflation is way outside their jurisdiction. And the people who can deal with it by spending more to build productive capacity, right? To democratize the economy, to tame abusive market power. We're talking about MPs, prime ministers, presidents, congresses around the world. They do nothing, right? Why? Because they're brought to you, they're sponsored by corporate power, right? So it's fundamentally a question of democracy. And I'm not saying anything new here for heterodox economists, but I'm trying to connect the dots, because we fight corporate power for different reasons usually, not because it's the source of inflation, not because it's fundamentally corrupting the political system. And we deal with inflation when we talk about monetary policy and monetary theory as if that's where actually the jurisdiction of inflation struggles are, right? So we have to connect the dots here and think differently. And I would invite people in India and other parts, especially young graduate students, when you think about macroeconomic research, to think outside the existing paradigms about what causes inflation and what the fiscal constraints are. So fundamentally, MMT is saying a government with a high degree of monetary sovereignty can spend way beyond what mainstream economists usually tell us. We need to worry about the government debt and all of that. And that spending is not infinite, it's not unlimited. It's constrained by these two factors, availability of productive capacity, resources, and abusive market power. And when we have a clear understanding of what those constraints are, then we can push those limits, not by wishful thinking, but by real action. And you push the risk of inflation further and further out by doing what? By spending strategically to increase productive capacity in areas that increase your resilience. Here we're thinking food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, productive capacity in health and transportation, education. And that allows you to tame the risk of inflation. Notice what I said, you spend more strategically to tame the risk of inflation. Mainstream economists will tell you if you spend more, you cause inflation, right? Very different outcome. And number two, if you tax and regulate abusive market power out of existence and deal with the corruption in the system, then you're actually pushing the risk of inflation further out, right? Whereas mainstream economics tells us to deal with inflation, you need fiscal austerity, spend less. Spending less meaning you have even less productive capacity, which means you rely even more on imports, which means your risk of inflation over time increases, not decreases. When you don't target corruption in the system and abusive market power domestically and globally, you're actually fueling the inflation pressure points that you have in the system, not taming them. So the neoliberal fiscal austerity framework produces the results, the exact opposite of what you want for a healthy economy, what you want for a democracy, fundamentally. And what this spectrum of monetary sovereignty analysis does, that shines this bright light on the actual constraint, on the mechanics of what is happening, and allows us to make a decision and show alternative solutions. We can decide what we want to do with our degree of monetary sovereignty is invade a neighboring country because we can afford it. That's what shining a bright light on the possibilities does. But does that mean we should do it? Is this what we want as a country? Is this what we want as a world? Right? So so in a sense, sometimes you hear people saying MMT is not political. That's what people mean. They mean it shows you the options, and you can use the abusive market power to abuse more, right? Or you can use the analysis to replace an existing corrupt political entity, corporate entity, replace it with your own family's political entity and power, right? With a new prime minister. That fundamentally doesn't change anything. It allows you to grab power and control the system in different ways. MMT is saying for a democracy, for justice, for sustainability, we do have options. And those options require fundamental shifts in the way we do things, changing the economic engine. Whereas the mainstream today is telling us there are no options. Even progressives in the political space will say, well, yeah, we need to have a Green New Deal. We need to invest in sustainability. We need to invest in education and justice and all of that. But in order to do that, we need to tax the rich because we need their money, right? Or we need to take from the military budget and give it to social services, right? And MMT is saying, no, not necessarily. If you want to tax the rich, we should tax the rich out of existence. Well, we're talking about oligarchs here, super, multi-billionaires and all that. We're not talking about doctors and engineers who have a little bit of, disposable income, so to speak. So tax them not because we need their money or their permission to have sustainable, agriculture or sustainable energy system. Tax pollution because we want to decarbonize, not because we need the money or permission of oil and gas companies, right? So MMT decouples the role of taxation at the national level from the spending part. So spend on national priorities because we want to build resilience, because we want an equitable economy and so on, because we're changing the engine. And then tax in order to reduce pollution, reduce inequality, reduce corruption and abuse and political influence by the oligarchs. Tax speculation in financial markets, right? Tax these things out of existence, not because we need their money, not because we need their permission. And here, this is, I'll just emphasize kind of one political strategy component, which is when we say we want to tax the rich in order to fund a healthcare system, you're giving them even more power by building your economic strategy on their wealth. Because if we want to fund health care with taxation on the wealthy, it means in order for us to have a more generous health system or social services system, we need the wealthy to be even wealthier, so we can tax even more of their wealth, so we can have our healthcare system, our social services system. And by doing that, you've just given them more power, because now they're even more influential and say, well, we're doing our part, so let us grow our wealth, our influence in politics, in the economy, our abusive market power, so you can tax a little bit of our wealth to have your little healthcare system. Right? We're saying, no. We don't need your permission. We don't need more of your abusive power. We're going to tax your abusive market power out of existence. We're going to tax your ill-gotten, excessive, extreme, obscene wealth out of existence, because it's part of that economic engine that we're trying to replace, the economic engine that automatically produces inequality. We want to replace it with an economic engine that produces equity and justice, an economic engine that automatically produces pollution. We're going to replace it with a decarbonized economic engine, right? So we have to be very careful in decoupling the taxation part from the spending part. And that's fundamentally an MMT concept that I hope that many of our colleagues in the heterodox economics profession will begin to synthesize their approach to economic development, to public policy, with these principles that I believe are transformational in terms of not just economic thinking, but in terms of the outcome when it comes to public policy and social policy.
There's a little comment here from Randeep. He says, allow the wealthy to become wealthier to extract more revenue to fund public services. That's the standard defense, he says, of Tories in the UK.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And same in the US. Yeah. And it's fundamentally, wrong as a principle. If we want to fund healthcare by increasing taxes on smoking, then your healthcare budget is dependent on more people smoking and becoming unhealthy, so we can charge them more taxes to fund the healthcare system. It's just fundamentally flawed, right?
Right. I'm going to ask the next two planned questions first, and then we'll take more questions from the audience, making it more interactive. So the second last really question that I had was, how should developing countries in that case work towards monetary sovereignty, climate resilience, sustainable prosperity?
Yeah, you start with the foundations, right? And this is where the problem is. Most countries today, when they're exposed to this, they say, well, in order to escape this debt trap, we need to generate more dollar revenues to pay the external debt, and then we'll build resilience. And my argument is that no, if you do that, you're continuing the trap, right? You're chasing the same, external dollars in a way that feeds the trap. So what you want to do is start with the foundation. And you don't have to change, your system overnight, but spend strategically. In other words, let's say, I'll use the example of Tunisia, my home country. Let's say Tunisia today wants to spend an additional 2 billion dinars in national currency, right? Not borrowed from abroad, sovereign government spending an additional 2 billion dinars added to the deficit of that year's budget on health and education, very important sectors. You can spend it in a way that's inflationary, that feeds the problems that we're talking about. And you can spend it strategically in a way that builds resilience and gives you a higher degree of monetary sovereignty. I'll run through the example very quickly. The mainstream way you spend on health and education and you don't fundamentally change anything else, this is what's going to happen. Your food imports are going to increase. You're going to have more trade deficit. Your currency will weaken relative to the dollar. And now all of a sudden, everything you import is more expensive, right? You have inflation pass-through effect. And eventually, the government has to step in and stabilize the exchange rate by borrowing more externally, by subsidizing food and transportation and basic services for the public. The deficit is even bigger. And now international institutions will come in and say, well, you have a problem here. You're spending too much. You need austerity. So we're back to square one. You cut spending on health and education and you go back to doing essentially the same. That's the mainstream approach of doing it. And that's where a lot of people say, well, the only way to do this the right way is really earn the dollar revenues from abroad via exports, remittances, tourism, and then use them to build a better healthcare system. which means you're always dependent on those dollars, which is part of the trap because you're never closing that external balance. You're just spinning your wheels in the same system. As a matter of fact, the external balance gets bigger and bigger for most countries over time. So here's the MMT approach to doing this. We want to spend 2 billion dinars on health and education because these are important sectors. Here's what you need to do. Instead of spending the 2 billion on health and education, let's spend 1 billion for this first year on health and education. And then the other billion that we're spending is going to be spent on building a higher degree of food sovereignty domestically, more productive capacity, and food and renewable energy. Small baby steps for that first year. And at the same time, you're going to tax and regulate abusive market power and tackle corruption in those sectors. And at the same time, you're going to crack down on unnecessary imports of luxury items and things like which is part of the corruption system, abusive market power, and all of that. So same 2 billion dinars spent, but with different vision. All of a sudden, the outcome is going to be you're going to have fewer food imports, fewer energy imports, and you're going to have a healthier external balance right now, which means potentially a stronger exchange rate. Your credit rating will actually improve, right? And you're going to have more resilience to external shocks related to food prices, to energy prices. And that's just the first year. And now that you discover you can actually build resilience gradually with small steps, you ask yourself, well, is the actual limit 2 billion dinars per year? Maybe it's 6, maybe it's 12. What determines how much the government can actually spend, we're back to square one now with the MMT concept, is not the amount of revenue you generate as a country, but it's really, do you have the productive capacity to build a higher degree of food security, of food sovereignty in the system, the skills, the resources, the land, the water that you need to actually build that. If you do, then maybe the limit is 5 billion dinars instead of 2. Do you have the logistical administrative capacity to tackle corruption, for transparency, to enforce, to actually manage this operation with successfully? If you do, then you could expand. The sky is the limit, so to speak. It's not the 1 billion or 2 billion of deficit. So that's really how I think most developing countries, and the constraints are different, the corruption systems are different, the resource availability is different. For some countries, there are no resources, right? Which means you have to rely on that global South network strategy that I described because of lack of natural resources or technology or capabilities. But in most countries, the resources are actually there, but they're misallocated to feed the neo-colonial system. I'll give you one example from Tunisia, but I can pick other countries too. Tunisia is a big exporter of fruits like strawberries to Europe because of the climate is great for growing the crops. But these crops are massive consumers of water, and they're allocated the most fertile land in the country. So you dedicate the most fertile land, the most precious, scarce water resources to producing a crop for exports because it generates the dollars and euros that you need to buy the fuel, to buy the medicine that you need. And it adds nothing to your food security, your food sovereignty, right? And at the same time, a country like Tunisia needs to import wheat, which is a major crop, right? At prices that are controlled by global superpowers, prices that you can't control. So what we're talking about here is when you change the economic engine, you realize you don't need to produce as many strawberries for the sake of producing for the global supply chain. You need to reallocate your resources more effectively to produce the food resilience that you need. So you reallocate resources within the system and break away from the kind of dependence on global supply chain because you're dependent on those dollars and euros to pay the external debt. The same applies in manufacturing, by the way. A lot of the manufacturing that happens in the global South is not to build resilience domestically. It's just to earn the dollars that you need to pay external debt, to import food, to import energy, and so on. Well, maybe our industrial strategy should be focused on building resilience internally. And if internally it's a small market, which is the case in most countries, you can't really have economies of scale in a market of 10 million consumers. Maybe our industrial strategy should be a market of 200 million consumers and a neighboring global South trading bloc, whereby we use strategic cooperation to build that level of resilience, as opposed to exclusively, almost exclusively, servicing the global supply chain, which means you may have a ministry of industry, but you don't actually have an industrial policy. Your industrial policy is to do whatever it takes to serve the global supply chain. Your industrial policy is determined for you by global corporations in the global north, right? So it's an illusion that we have a Ministry of Agriculture, that we have a Ministry of Industry, that we have a Ministry of Energy. But these are really satellite ministries, fundamentally, that are serving the global north economic machine that we've been describing. And that global north economic machine, whether it's stated explicitly or implicitly, is fundamentally the legacy of colonial economic machines, became post-colonial economic machines. You put a national flag on top of it and you appoint a minister born and raised in your country, doesn't mean that you have an industrial policy or an agricultural policy. That's the type of fundamental shift in thinking that we need to be addressing. And the economics profession is guilty as charged when it comes to, validating this system, and validating it not necessarily by colleagues in the global north, by, young graduate students and young economists who are part of the colonized curriculum. That's why many of us have been talking about decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing the economics profession, economic theory. And it's like moving mountains, obviously. This is kind of what the theme of this discussion today. But you can't move mountains unless you know what you're doing, right? And unless you collaborate with the large kind of strategic plan with colleagues and like-minded people who understand why the existing system is not working for people in the global South and people in the global North too.
Right. So, outside of the West, we have this tendency to turn to East Asia, and we see if we can replicate developmental strategies from there. And Japan is being considered an MMT exemplar. Can you tell us a little bit about Japan's monetary policy? There is a related question from Tomo on Twitter. So I'm getting questions from everywhere, not just on Zoom, but also from Twitter. It's going crazy.
I'm impressed. I don't even know how you're managing all the questions coming from everywhere. But this is a very good question. I'm glad you asked this to clarify. So a lot of MMT economists have been referring to Japan not as a case of a government that learned MMT principles and have been applying them successfully, but we've pointed to Japan from more than 20 years ago now, when credit rating agencies started to downgrade the Japanese debt, government debt. And when everybody in the economics profession, mainstream economics profession, predicted that Japan will have inflation, maybe hyperinflation, high interest rates, and all the problems that we're told a country would have if the government has a massive amount of government debt and large fiscal deficits and so on. And what MMT has demonstrated is that Japan is on that higher end of degree of monetary sovereignty, on that spectrum of monetary sovereignty. Why? Because the entire debt stock today, I think it's 265% of GDP, debt to GDP ratio, is all denominated in Japanese yen. Japan has one of the highest levels of productive capacity. Japan specializes in high value added content manufacturing, right? Japan has food sovereignty, food security, and has the resilience to allow it to acquire food from other parts of the world too as needed. But it's really, those are the fundamentals that allow the Japanese government to have large fiscal deficits, large national debt, without facing the fiscal constraint that a country in the global South would face. So what do we have in reality? Largest debt to GDP ratio in the world for decades now, literally. And Japan doesn't have any inflation. Japan's problem is deflation, right? Japan doesn't have high interest rate. Japan's problem is negative interest rates most of the time for decades now, right? So that's the part where the MMT analysis of the fiscal constraint of exchange rates. Japan has a very strong exchange rate, obviously. not a devaluated currency. And it's not because of the deficit, it's because of the industrial capacity, right? Now, Japan doesn't have to race to the bottom to export more. Why? Because Japan is racing to the top, specializing in research and development and innovation, creating new markets, and passing on the assembly line, low value added content manufacturing to smaller developing countries, right? And this didn't happen by accident. You can go all the way back to the 1960s and listen to finance ministers, ministers of the economy, and I'm blanking on names here. At the time, the Minister of the Economy referred to the concept of the flying geese economic development model. He said the flying geese, they fly in a V with the leader of the flock is metaphorically here, the country that innovates, creates new technologies, higher value added content, and then passes on the obsolete technologies, the lower value added content manufacturing to the geese in the back of the flock, right? The developing countries that need the manufacturing jobs, but don't have the technical capabilities to innovate and so on. It didn't happen by accident, right? That's why I say high degrees of monetary sovereignty, you don't put them in place by decree. You earn them with strategic policies, long-term strategic policies. So Japan has other problems. They have problems in terms of their demographic pyramid. They have problems in terms of lack of immigration and productivity of labor, all kinds of other problems. But they're not fiscal problems related to the deficit, right, or the national debt. So does that mean that the government in Japan today is following MMT insights to figure out solutions to their problems? No, I don't think so, because especially if you pay attention to what Prime Minister Abe has done over the last few years during his tenure, it's completely antithetical, and it shows that he's really worried about the deficit in the national debt. He's listening to the mainstream financial market analysts and so on who say your debt is out of control. So what did he try to do? Raise taxes and reduce fiscal spending. And then, hand the keys to the central bank, which has very little jurisdiction on the rest of the economy, obviously, other than moving interest rates into negative territory, trying to escape a deflationary trap. So I hope it captures some of the ideas that people have in mind when they refer to MMT in Japan.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to shift back. We're going to go from Japan to India. We have two questions. One is from Randeep. He says, do developing countries have the institutional capacity to deal with the rentier or the domestic capitalist class? And he says in India, industrialists have successfully campaigned against a strong developmental state. There are a couple of other questions, so I'm going to just read them off quickly. Shakuntala has a comment. She says, one of the most problematic frameworks that India has been functioning in the context of monetary economics is inflation targeting. So she says that MMT can be useful in providing theoretical and empirical foundations to pursue the alternative framework. Here's a very, very important question from Shurajit Das from JNU, Professor Das. He says, thanks, Professor, for an extremely interesting lecture. I have a question. Should there be an upper limit on deficit to GDP ratio for an economy operating well below full employment and full capacity of activity? And he says, if yes, why? And he also says that according to MMT, is it always possible to print money and spend under a demand constraint situation?
Very good question. I'm going to take the questions starting from the back with Professor Das's question. And if I miss anything, please remind me, because I'm not looking at the questions in front of me. So on the question, should there be an upper limit on fiscal spending or deficit spending? There is no exact limit, numerical limit. That numerical limit can be determined empirically on a case-by-case basis. And that's where I'm inviting colleagues to help contribute to this empirical research. I've been involved in doing this kind of work kind of behind the scenes with a large team of grad students and colleagues, but we're not even close in terms of putting the entire model together. We're outnumbered by the mainstream and understaffed in this, but there are ways to do it. And here's kind of sketching how you get to determining that. As I said in the example I gave earlier with the case of Tunisia, what determines whether the limit is 2 billion or 3 billion or 7 billion is the availability of productive capacity. And the additional spending that you're putting in the economy is going to create additional inflationary pressure points, potentially. For example, you hire 1 million people and pay them decent wages to do important work that the country needs. And it's a free country. They're going to go spend it on transportation, energy, food, housing, textiles, whatever they want. We know more or less what a middle-class family spends their money on. So we can anticipate the additional demand increases in different sectors. For the global South, the additional demand pressure points will often translate into imports, right? So that's why you spend strategically, so that you're just not creating the demand and additional income and jobs, but you're anticipating where the additional demand is going and where you have shortages of productive capacity domestically, where you have weaknesses in terms of resilience to these external shocks. And you start spending strategically to build that resilience in terms of domestic capabilities and to tax and regulate abusive market power in key areas that will experience that additional demand, right? So that becomes your macro strategy. And that will determine your capacity to administer logistically. This will determine what the upper limit is. But there is no magical number that says it's got to be 150% debt to GDP ratio. That's what the mainstream thought about Japan. When Japan's debt to GDP ratio hit 100%, they said, this is it, Japan is going bankrupt. And then it hit 120, 130. They downgraded the debt. And today it's 265, and they still don't know what's going on. Why is Japan not going bankrupt? Why is Japan not experiencing hyperinflation and Venezuela is? Well, Venezuela's situation is very different. It's a country that has virtually no productive capacity, no food security, and depends on one industry, which is the oil export industry. And all it took is a US embargo on spare parts for the oil and gas industry. You can't buy spare parts, you can't pump oil, you can't export oil, the country is bankrupt, right? Japan doesn't face that situation. So I hope I answered Professor Das's question, and I don't know if I missed any part, Ruchira. Going back to Shakuntala's question, I believe, which is on inflation targeting, very important. And if you remember, after 2008, all major central banks and European Central Bank, the Fed, the Bank of Japan, UK, all of these central banks were targeting inflation to at 2%, right? Because they're trying to avoid the deflation cycle that we're experiencing. So they literally used every trick in the textbook, right, to push inflation to a higher level. And they thought quantitative easing, being more comfortable with large deficits, with large national debt, will certainly cause inflation to go up. And they all missed their inflation targets by a wide margin. Eventually, the Fed admitted, they said, we have no reliable theory of inflation. We thought all of this will cause inflation. Japan obviously has been doing this for 3 decades now, targeting inflation and still getting deflation. Again, no understanding of what actually causes inflation. The ECB, Mario Draghi, the week before he ended his term and retired from the ECB in a press conference, completely unprompted, nobody asked him about MMT or any of that. He said, we literally tried everything in the last decade, post 2008 economic crisis. And he said, it's time for governments, European governments, to consider some of the insights, some of the new ideas from MMT. So the mainstream is recognizing that inflation targeting, the way it's been theorized, the way it's been implemented, doesn't work for reasons that I described earlier, which is the actual inflation pressure points are way outside the jurisdiction of the central bank. So which agencies are best equipped to do inflation targeting? It's definitely not the central bank. It's your Ministry of Agriculture. I'm talking about the Global South here. It's your Ministry of Energy, hopefully your Renewable Energy Commission. They have the inflation targeting tools in their hands. It's your MPs, it's your Prime Minister, it's your presidents, it's the fiscal authorities who know how to tame the risk of inflation, how to target inflation by building productive capacity in strategic areas, by taxing and regulating abusive market power. That's how you tame inflation. The problem is even the most populist politicians that you see, and here I'm referring to my own country in Tunisia with the populist president that we had, kind of brought to power completely without any political power, like literally from the people, retired university professor with no political history, but kind of dealing with the issues of corruption, the neglect, the abuse that the corrupt political system has generated even after the revolution of 2011. His populist strategy to deal with corruption and abuse is to essentially start a clean slate with the powerful corporations, the wealthy, and saying, here's what you're going to do. We're going to set you free as long as you agree to take a portion of your ill-gotten money and invest it in social services, right? In the most neglected regions. So even the most populist visions that we have in the seat of power still believes that you need the money and the permission of the wealthy to do social services, to address unemployment and inequality and all of that. And that's fundamentally shooting yourself in the foot by handing the keys to the well-being of the economy to powerful entities that have abused and extracted from the system and will continue to do so, right? Because the president will be out of office after a few years, and the deep structural corporate power will still be in place, right? So I hope I answered Shakuntala's question about inflation targeting. You don't do inflation targeting via central bank policy. You do it with the other policies. That doesn't mean central banks have no role to play, but it's not the thing that economists and central bankers make it to be. And then I want to go back to Randeep's earlier question. If you could refresh my memory, because by now I lost it.
He's asking, do developing countries have the institutional capacity to deal with the rentier class? How do we achieve debt to the rentiers? No, sorry.
Yeah, what I described here in Tunisia is probably the best answer to Randeep's question. It's that institutional capacity. Most people think of it in terms of having the bureaucrats and the administration and the laws on the books. Well, those are important. You can have those. But if you have all of those, but still think that you need the money or permission from the wealthy to reallocate resources to the most neglected rural areas for economic development, then we're not going anywhere. That's why I think it's important to have a paradigm shift in terms of the fundamentals of the engine of the economy, and then use that with the transparent democratic system, with the proper institutional capacity to do it. But it's not sufficient to say, we lack the institutional capacity, we don't have the laws, we don't have the enforcement, but not have, you could blame everything on corruption and blame everything on lack of institutional capacity, or people are lazy. That actually feeds the same problem. And I think that the example that I just gave in Tunisia, you can see it in country after country after country. And this is, again, I emphasize, this is by a very populist president, unlike many other populists, who rose to the top kind of from the ranks of the people because of the frustration with the neoliberal corruption, neoliberal inequality results, unemployment, and all of that. So that's why when I talk about, people say, is it time for a pitchfork? They say, well, yeah, pitchforks are okay, but you have to have well-informed pitchforks empowered by a strategic alternative. Because what we've had is that pitchforks overthrow a government, get in office, and then restart the same economic engine, and think that if you do it with a good heart, if you do it without corruption, that everything will be fine. And what we're saying is, no, that extractive system works in an extractive way, whether you have corruption or not. Of course, corruption makes it worse, whether you have abusive power or not. We're talking about changing the engine altogether.
In the spirit of having well-informed pitchforks, could you identify some of the unique contributions of modern money theory to development policy in the global South?
Well, I think as I stated here, and this is a good transition, we can't just criticize neoliberal economics and mainstream economics and abuse of power, and do it just as an intellectual exercise in order to score points, right, or to publish papers. I think this, at least this is my personal commitment and understanding of this. I think it's just as important, if not even more important, to translate all the insights that we've been talking about in the academic community, not only to policymakers, well-intentioned policymakers, but also to the media, because they're a big part of narrative building and empowering, and most importantly, to civil society groups, because we do have people fighting for food sovereignty for decades, right? But they're fighting that fight on a particular space, right? Not in a paradigm shift that we're describing here. We do have people fighting for climate justice. We do have people fighting for reparations. We do have people fighting corruption, but all in one kind of satellite area, vaguely connected kind of to the big shift, but not strategically connected. And what we're talking about today is, how do we build a coherent alternative, not just at the national level in a particular country in the global south, but on a global scale, on a global south scale, right? So I think our role is to take this to the streets, so to speak, not in terms of protest, but take this to the public and to vulgarize these ideas, translate these ideas, and literally translate them into languages, like foreign languages in the global south, native languages, so that people escape the cycle of despair, because there's plenty of it all around. Despair, by which people mean politicians are corrupt, corporations are too powerful, there's, climate change is destroying everything, inequality is way too big to deal with, unless we have money from the rich, or unless we have all the mainstream ideas. So empower people with an alternative. Remember, Margaret Thatcher says there is no alternative, and MMT is saying no, there is an alternative, and it's not easy to get to, but it's within reach if we have a fundamental rethinking of how we connect the dots between all of these movements and have a coherent economic strategy to get to it. And I'll give you, I'll close with the statement that kind of connects us to the spectrum of monetary sovereignty. When we said countries like the US and Japan have a high degree of monetary sovereignty, which means a larger fiscal spending capacity than countries on the lower end of the spectrum, right? How are we going to deal with climate change in the global south if our fiscal capacity is limited? That's why the concept of reparation becomes important. The countries that already have a high degree of monetary sovereignty have the moral and ethical responsibility for climate change since the Industrial Revolution, have the higher degree of productive capacity, research and development, technical capabilities. Those countries need to repair the damage by transferring financial resources, canceling debt, and transferring physical productive capacity and technological innovation and cooperation to move the countries in the global south to a higher degree of resilience, fix the damage from climate change, and decolonize the system, right? So I think of reparations in that monetary sovereignty spectrum as a single system. So not reparations because we need charity, reparations because there's damage that's been done, you're responsible for it, you have the capacity for it, you can't claim we can't afford it, because we know you can afford it, right? You have the fiscal capacity, the technological capacity. That's how we shift the conversation. I hope it answers your question. So empowering people at the grassroots level, at the policy level, in the media, means we can call their bluff when they say we don't have money. We can call their bluff when we say, oh, India and China are the biggest polluters. Why do you ask us to pay for climate action today? So call their bluff with a coherent alternative, not at the theory level, but at the practical day-to-day talking points, organizing points. So empower people, educate, mobilize people with the coherent narrative so that we can make a dent in this, because we outnumber, not just in the global south, but in terms of economic power, we outnumber the few who control the system. And I think without a coherent narrative, they'll continue to dominate. Think of the Great Reset, right? The global North Great Reset. Nothing is going to be reset. It's called the Great Reset so that nothing changes fundamentally. It's kind of addressing inequality all around the margin, addressing climate change around the margin, but it's really no Great Reset. It's kind of ironic that they stole the label of the Great Reset for that purpose.
So last, we'll just end with, I guess, Drew's question, which I still haven't asked. So he just wants to know, how do we get MMT-informed graduates interested in development, and how do we get development-interested graduates interested in MMT? Both ways.
Oh, I think having more of these conversations, having more kind of informal conversation format, because it's not about kind of brainwashing people into a particular framework. I don't believe in that. I think bringing graduate students who are interested in economic development, for example, to wrestle with these fundamental questions about colonialism, because your standard economics textbooks about economic development is not addressing the issue of colonialism and post-colonialism systematically. Your economic models, right, are not built and designed to help you question the existing system. It's designed to essentially fuel the dominant narrative, tweak around the edges. You can walk into it with a great heart, with the commitment to dealing with poverty, with dealing with inequality, but you're still within that box, right? And once you start questioning, once you learn about history, once you learn about law, once you learn about all of these interdisciplinary dimensions, which are fundamentally excluded from economic textbooks and the economics profession, then you start to get a full picture. I'll give you an example. If you're interested in climate change, you can't really address the problem of climate change from a purely economic perspective, because it has a political dimension, an ethical dimension, a scientific dimension. So it's by nature a multidisciplinary question, and all the big questions of poverty, of unemployment, inequality, they're not purely economic. There are other dimensions, psychological dimensions, public health dimensions, and so on. So our analysis has to be interdisciplinary. Our solutions have to be multi-pronged, right? Complex problems don't usually require simplistic, single-focused solutions. And if we start with that principle, then we go in with an open mind to think about other questions. And then whatever the policy solutions you come up with, eventually you're going to be faced with the constraint. Where will the money come to pay for this very important strategy that you develop? And you realize, well, you have a fiscal constraint. So instead of addressing fundamentally the issue of poverty or climate change, you're going to have to do maybe 5% of what you initially thought would be necessary, right? So you're going to be faced there, and that's what keeps us trapped. MMT says, well, maybe you can do the full amount. Let's look at the broader impact. Let's look at the inflation pressure points. Where do these inflation pressure points come from? Is it the food sector? Is it the energy sector? Is it abusive market power? Is it the telecoms? It varies from country to country, of course. So now you realize you can actually get your full spending to deal with poverty or climate change or whatever it is. But at the same time, you have to do all the other things that will actually allow you to tame the inflation pressure points, build additional resilience, and democratize your economy, make it more competitive. So not a simple solution. It's much more complicated, multi-pronged, but allows you to get to the fundamental problem you're dealing with, which is poverty or climate change or whatever it is. That's what MMT is fundamentally trying to say. Don't stick to the fiscal constraints that the textbook gave you, because that's what all good, well-intentioned policymakers, colleagues in the economics profession often conclude is that, yeah, it would be great if we could tackle this, that, and the other fully, but it's too bad we have a fiscal constraint. It's too bad we have an external constraint. So we're going to have to stay within our lane, so to speak.
Thanks a lot, Fadhel, for joining us. We are in the middle of a third wave of COVID-19 in India. But despite that, we've had great engagement. Here's an anonymous one about how policymakers should adopt rules of thumb. And yeah, these rules aren't conventional and require a high level of leadership from policymakers. Absolutely. Agreed with that. Thanks for joining us, Fadhel.
Thank you.
We've learned a lot, and and thank you all for being an excellent audience, and we should keep in touch, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, DM at Indian Eco Lab, and yeah, otherwise you can reach all of us on Twitter for everybody. Thank you all. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.